Hello and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and the ways in which we enhance human flourishing. And today we're reporting live from the European Resource Bank meeting in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm Thomas Walker-Worth, this is my wife Angelica, and we're joined today by Johan Norberg.
And what a pleasure it is to have you here, Johan. Johan, for those of you who may not be aware, is an author, a documentary filmmaker, a historian of ideas, an advocate of economic globalization and classical liberalism, a senior fellow at Cato, and as if that were not enough of a resume, he also has written at least 4 books that I'm aware of. Open, The Story of Human Progress, and then In Defense of Global Capitalism and Financial Fiasco. So great repository of information, and it's absolutely wonderful to have you here on the show to tap them. So.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So can we just start out briefly? Can you talk about some of the benefits of free movement and free trade for innovation, just broadly speaking?
Yeah. Well, broadly, I usually start by just thinking about time machines. If we had a time machine, where would we go? Well, nowhere. We'd stay here, unless we could go into the future. Because, my reading of history is that it was pretty bad. Whenever I look up my ancestors, wherever they were, it was a life of drudgery, of working as long as you could, unless you got too tired or exhausted from work, difficult to put food on the table, and difficult to make sure that your kids got a decent education, or any education. And that's the first major change, the dramatic change in history that we must all be aware of, that made me obsessed with innovation and freedom. Because you have to ask yourself, why was it that for thousands of years we had nothing? Well, there were some ups and downs. Obviously, things happened, people did things. But in terms of the average life expectancy, living standards, access to food, access to medical technology, nothing happened for thousands of years. And then suddenly, 200 years ago, in a tiny part of the world, it exploded. An explosion of creativity, of innovation, hard work, growth, and then in 200 years we reduced extreme poverty from 90% to 9% today. We increased life expectancy from 30 years to more than 70 years. You have to be obsessed with what happened then and why it happened, what made it possible. And to me, the major change was that for the first time we had a sufficiently big crack in the wall, in a way. The old centralized mercantilist economy run by nobles and kings who decided who did what and restricted production, capitalism, trade. For the first time there was a crack in the wall, and lots of creativity began to pass through and began to change everything they did, from the dramatic, from a steam engine to textile manufacturing to modern infrastructure, steamboats, cars and planes, to the small. People began to look at the horseshoes for the horses. Can I implement a different version of this? Looking at what the neighbors did, looking at the competition, and then improving it further. So basically, what happened was that we went from a world where just the ideas of a tiny few people at the top decided everything, and then nothing much happens, to a world where, to begin with, thousands and then millions of people got a chance to have a go, to experiment with crazy ideas. And most of them were probably crazy and lost and forgotten all about, but some of them made the modern world and all the technologies that make life so much better for us today.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful perspective to see that poverty was the starting point for the human race. And people often talk about now, why are certain people poor? Why is this percentage of the world poor? When really the question is, why is most of the world wealthy?
Yeah.
And how can we continue that and expand that? And how can we continue that and expand that?
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the biggest problems with mentality, is that you rarely have a long perspective backwards in time. You look at the world today and you see disparities and inequalities. Well, you have to ask yourself, why is this? Why is it that some people have so much and others almost nothing? Is it about inequality? Is it about capitalism related to inequality? And yes, it is in a way. It's an unequal distribution of capitalism because countries that have had capitalism for a long time have made it possible for more people to experiment in those ways, to improve the lives of themselves and the work of them and of their families, and then improve on it. And over a couple of generations, they've created the modern world. Whereas in other parts of the world, they haven't had that for a long time, and some not at all. And in some places, they've had it for a while, and then there's been a backlash. Like Venezuela, which was the richest country in South America, which is now the poorest country in South America. Well, then you can't be enough to just look at the status quo and try to look at those disparities. You have to ask yourself, where does it come from? And to me, it's incredibly, it's completely integrated with the whole concept of people having more freedoms to improve their lives. Yeah.
Absolutely. But some people, when you're talking about how we should have freedom to let people to move to other countries and to have these more open borders, are very concerned about what that does for the lower income countries that they're leaving behind. You hear about the brain drain effect. And how would you respond to that? Is that a serious problem, or are there ways of solving it? What would you say?
Yeah, it's important to think about this problem, whether it is a problem or not. And I happen to come from a philosophical conviction that individuals are ends in themselves. They're not means for the ends of society. So if people live in places that doesn't offer them opportunities, that doesn't offer them freedoms, it's their choice. It should be their choice to leave and go somewhere else where they might lead a more decent life, even if that then might mean, in some instances, that they are leaving a country behind that will be worse off without them there. So then the second question is, if people don't agree with my assumption that it's their right anyway, well, does it leave those countries in a worse state? It might, and definitely you can make the theoretical case that happens, but when you look at it empirically, you also see two other factors. One of them being that if people have at least broader options and more potential to go somewhere else with their talent, with their education and so on, people might invest more in that talent and in that education than they otherwise would have. If they're stuck in a place of subsistence, agriculture, and hopelessness and oppression, they might not think that investing lots of years in the potential of having more skills in the future would be worthwhile. So it might be that they're improving those skills because they have plan B, the ability to go somewhere else. And then not all of them will. And even if they do, eventually they might start to build up a more critical mass of talent back home and helping others to approach this. And some also return back home afterwards. And that's also one of the reasons why we've seen things like everything from the Indian ICT sector, internet communication, the tech companies in India, often people who left to get more education, their first jobs in the US, and then return with even more skills back home. So that's one factor. The other one is that, that's important to remember when we look at it empirically, is that when you have people, friends, relatives, former colleagues who leave for other places, they're not lost and forgotten forever, even if they stay there forever. You also build connections, you also build trade links. So you can see that if you have a diaspora in other countries, it increases trade links and communication links between those two countries. And I think this is also one major factor why many poor countries are improving rapidly. The case that they have become more cosmopolitan because lots of people have left for other places. So on the net, I would say that brain drain is in a way a brain gain for many poor countries.
Yeah, that segues into one of our other questions, because I like to say that Elon Musk has done more for South Africa in America than he ever could have done in South Africa, because PayPal and Starlink and those sorts of things are going to improve life in South Africa. But that's only if borders are open and people can, and that global growth, that global progress can help people in those other countries. So can you talk a bit about, I think a line you said in the book Progress, which is that global growth is far more important to human well-being than national growth is, and why that's the case?
Yeah, this is fascinating, and it's a bit counterintuitive. And I first learned about this in a paper by the economist William Easterly, who looked at growth and then every kind of indicator of living standards, health and opportunities and social stability of countries. And then you realize that, yes, there is a link between the growth of a country and those positive social indicators. But it's an even stronger correlation between global growth and the whole world's growth and what's happening back home when it comes to those social indicators. And you can see that if you look at even the countries that have done the worst economically in recent years. Take Haiti, tiny Caribbean Haiti, which has suffered an economic disaster. I don't think that GDP per capita has increased for 40 years or something like that. And yet life expectancy in Haiti has increased by 20 years. And infant mortality has declined by, I think it's 3/4 under this period. Why is that? Well, it's not the splendid, famous Haitian universities and medical drug firms in Haiti. It's because of global growth. And it's the fact that we have so much innovation and production and trade going on in the world, so that basically we have everyday low prices on all the goods and technologies that make for a good life. So in Haiti, it's so much easier to get access to than everything from, better concrete and furniture, but to vaccines and ventilators and refrigeration to keep food cold, keep a food chain so that people are being fed even in places where they can't produce much food. So, and that's one reason why it's actually more important to look at what goes on around you, further around you, than even in the economy back home. And that's a way in which we have a real time spontaneous redistribution going on in free market economies, because all the Elon Musks of the world and all the billionaires of the world are working tirelessly to reduce the price of everything that we need constantly, to make sure that more people buy it and get it. And that's why, yes, if you get just one Elon Musk to make it to a hospitable environment for innovation, that's better for the world than if he stays around with you back home in an awful environment where he wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah, so springboarding off of that, can we talk about one of the factors that make a more favorable environment for innovation, which is property rights? You talk a little bit in your book about examples with farms in China and land in Africa, but could you expand on that, on how property rights help encourage innovation?
Yeah, this is really a key thing, because this is new in history. This is really something that happened only some 200 years ago. Now there's a story, according to some Roman historians, about a first century innovator who invented unbreakable glass, which would have been nice, right? And what did he do? He went to the emperor and asked him, so look, this is a great innovation. Can I get some sort of reward? And the emperor looked at it. Wow, it really works. You can buckle it, but it doesn't break. So does anybody else know about the key to this innovation? And the innovator said, no. Okay, then I'll kill you. And he killed him and throw away the innovation, because he thought that this would undermine other professions, and this material might be the most expensive one in the future, and in that case gold would be worthless, and since he had most gold, why would he be interested in something like that? Now we don't know if it really happened like that, but we do know that since several Roman historians wrote about it, it probably made some sense to people reading it, that this is the kind of thing that could have happened in the Roman Empire. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us two things. First of all, he was killed by the emperor. He was not rewarded. It tells you something about the state of innovation back then. But it's also interesting that he went to the emperor in the first place. Because why didn't he set up shop and start to produce unbreakable glass and sell it to people? Because you didn't have safe property rights. You didn't have free trade. It was controlled. It was top-down decisions. You couldn't trade test your innovations and invest a lot of it and make a lot of money if you succeed eventually. And that's what property rights are about. And until some 200 years ago, in a few Western countries, it looked mostly like this. You didn't have that security of the title to land or to your innovations, to your commercial business. So anything could be taken away from you tomorrow if the emperor didn't like it, or the cousin of a senator, or what have you. And in that case, why invest? Why think long term? Why do anything that might pay off if you're successful 20 years from hence? In agriculture, why would you start to invest in better crops, in irrigation systems, if someone can just take it away from you, which is still the case in most poor countries, and that's one of the reasons why they are poor. But with the start of more secure property rights, what that really means is that it's not really just sort of protecting what's here and what's now. It's to protect the future. It's to protect the potential. It's to protect your dreams and your investments, and give you the security of knowing that if you succeed, if unbreakable glass or one more plot of wheat is successful, you'll make lots of it. And obviously that's good for work ethic, but it also means that you'll see more experiments, because then lots of people will experiment with different stuff and different innovations.
Yeah. No, we talked a bit about the social conditions that are conducive to innovation, which is basically freedom. The more freedom is, the more innovation you'll get. I tended to observe that the opposite is also true. Innovation helps create freedom. Things like the internet, space exploration, that massively sort of keep us ahead of government's attempts to close us down and control us. So could you talk a little about how innovation and progress scientifically and technologically changes cultural attitudes, changes the society?
That's very interesting. We have one of the great Swedish entrepreneurs, Jan Stenbeck, who opened up the Swedish television market. We had a television monopoly until the early 1990s in Sweden, only 2 government-run television stations. And he had a saying, and it is that politics will beat up all the sort of the interest groups. If the guys in charge are interested in something, they'll beat you up if you just have an interest. However, technology will beat politics. So if you manage to get around politics and through innovation, through technology, then politics will lose out and will have to follow you. So what he did was that he set up shop in Britain, where it was allowed to do that, and sent Swedish television over satellite. So anyone with a satellite dish in Sweden could suddenly see his private commercial television stations. And what that meant was that Swedish politicians then just had to come around and say, okay, but it's already happening, so why should he be the only one doing this? Let's allow other private channels to do the same thing. And I think this is something that we're seeing again and again in history as well, that people are remarkably innovative at coming up with ways of bypassing the old regulatory structure. I mean, one of the ways in which the whole all the platform companies, all the Ubers and the food ordering stuff and so on, Airbnbs, they're ways of getting around traditional, often monopoly-oriented sectors. I mean, you could go, if you think there are a few taxis in your city, you could go to the taxi board and complain. I think that New York should sell more taxi licenses so that I can get a taxi when I need one. Yeah, but you can also build an app for that and make sure that you can just order one and make sure that it happens. And then you don't have to go through all those structures. You don't have to change politicians' minds. You put them in front of a fait accompli. It's already done, and the only way then is, okay, how do we integrate that in the old system? Unfortunately, it doesn't work for everybody, because politics is still strong and they can regulate you out of existence as well if they really don't like you. And one of the reasons why Uber succeeded in a couple of businesses like that is that they had already built such a momentum and had so many customers so that it was difficult when cities and states began to try to shut them down. And that tells you why it's not enough with technology. You also need a political sort of strife constantly to make sure that regulations aren't too tight. But I do think that technology helps.
Well, certainly. So on that note, you hear particularly among environmentalists, but I think it's becoming a sort of common thread in our culture, that there's this idea that anything that's natural is good and anything that's artificial is bad. And I think they are not using a wide enough definition of artificial usually when they say that, but you hear this refrain quite a bit. And I imagine that's sort of a strain on innovation because it's essentially all artificial. And do you have any ideas on how to combat that, or if something I said was wrong?
No, I really agree completely. And you know, tobacco is natural. Doesn't mean it's good for your health. So it's a completely artificial, cultural. It's almost a religious approach to what's natural. I mean, really, what's natural is to die in childbirth, and definitely, it's not natural to be able to drink clean water and not die from it. Kids used to drink beer for breakfast because 200 years ago, because that was the only way to not kill them when they were had to drink something and you didn't have a safe supply of water. It's only chemicals and lots of filtering that makes it possible for us to drink it. So artificial is good if we tailor it to our needs, and natural stuff can be good too, but lots of them kill us as well. I think in a way it's also, forgive the pun, but I mean it's a natural instinct to think that what's natural is safe because you come from somewhere. It's the status quo thing. Anything that's new and strange might kill you. You better beware a little bit. And I think throughout history, it's also the case that innovation was dangerous. Not just because you could blow your fingers off or something. It's also that anything that's brand new, when you live close to the edge of subsistence, is dangerous. Our ancestors worked incredibly hard just to get any kind of food on the table. And then if you have an eccentric in your group saying that now let's grow something else, let's see if we can dig here instead, could be a threat to your survival, and you'd better shut him down. So at least it made sense to be a little bit cautious and worried about this new artificial thing. Obviously, it's only the fact that we had those eccentrics that got us out of it as well, but that doesn't help us, our instincts in any ways to come to terms with it. And it makes less sense now than ever when we are in a safer environment, where we don't live that close to subsistence, and we can allow for 100 experiments and see 99 fail if the 100th is worthwhile. That doesn't work if you're on that close to starvation, then you don't like that. So I think there are natural reasons, evolutionary reasons, why we have this fear of the new and of the artificial, but it's incredibly dangerous. It is really the one thing that holds us back. And for example, when it comes to food production now, we're able to feed the world, even with Putin invading Ukraine and lots of countries implementing export bans on food. We could feed the world with genetically modified crops. It's just that we are trying to shut it down everywhere because of this fear of what's artificial. And that's also another reason why it's not enough with the technology in itself. We also need the ideological superstructure to explain innovation and technology and why it's important.
Is this interesting coincidence that you should go on to GM crops, because that's actually our next question. And I tend to think that the phrase genetically modified has taken on the same kind of stigma that radiation had in the 1950s. When everyone, you had science fiction films coming out about, how green radiation from space is going to kill us all, and just this complete, which still persists, this complete, irrational fear of radiation and of anything that's, sort of unknown and scientific. People seem to have this default fear reaction to, and they don't want to live near nuclear power plants, and they don't want to eat genetically modified food. Even though both those things are massively better for their well-being than the alternatives. So why do people have this reaction to GM in particular? Why does Europe ban it pretty much outright? And what can we do to change that?
Yeah. Well, I think the first reason is that this fear of what's strange and what's new and what you don't understand. Honestly, how many of us understand sort of DNA and how you twist and tweak it? If you combine that with this fear of what's new, or understand radiation for that matter, and then you forget that you get more radiation when you're out on town or take a plane and sort of have natural radiation than living close to a nuclear power plant. But it doesn't matter because it feels like it's very strange. And why do we do this? And I mean, when I talk to people about genetically improved, I'd say, to try to give it a better tagline, stuff, people come up with all sorts of weird fears about, I don't know how it will alter my DNA. I don't want DNA in my food. Do you know that everything's made up of DNA? No, why? No, it can't be. And I've even seen stores saying, we have no genes in our food. And that tells you something about the state of knowledge. And obviously then it's easy for people who campaign against this on ideological or eco-religious grounds. It's easy for them to capture the imagination of people and make them fearful, even though no scientist would ever accept anything like that. But then there's another reason, and it's that when you've done that for a while, when you made it so incredibly difficult to open up the European market for GM foods, then you build a pressure group of farmers and of the European food industry who are now completely invested in traditional ways of doing stuff. And they then have to talk it up and say that this is the only good and safe and decent option. Don't buy American food because it'll turn you into something bizarre. They might have a point. No, so that's how you get those pressure groups who have an incentive in making sure that they are not hurt economically by innovation. And the further this goes along, the bigger the disaster will be for local agriculture if they have not been allowed to experiment it. So it's a very dangerous dynamic there.
Yeah.
So that leads nicely into our next question as well, which is, do you think that fear is the main reason that people are so pessimistic about the future? You know, I'm relatively young, but it even feels like to me in the past couple of years, everyone's acting like it's Armageddon, and that didn't always used to be the case. So is that the main factor, do you think? Are there other key factors to consider?
I think there's a lot. This is one of them. I think that another one is that we are just over-invested in politics, all of us. And now we all play politics in a way, even if we're not involved in party politics, by just being online on social media and Twitter and seeing what goes on. And partly because politics has become more of a spectator sport. Fewer people directly involved, but you have to create the drama to get the rest of us to pay any kind of attention to it. It makes us incredibly exhausted with some pretty bad people and lots of nasty tempers and aggressive polarized politics. And that makes us depressed because, I mean, look at you don't even have to go to sort of the despots of the world, the Xi Jinpings and the Putins. You can look at our own crowd. It's easy to become depressed by it and by the lack of any kind of constructive agenda that would really improve the world. And the key to remaining an optimist in this kind of world, I think, is to ignore politics, at least a little bit, not to be too consumed by it, because you'll always think that everybody's crazy, and you will only see the most bizarre, weirdest, and most stupid people, because that's what's retweeted by your side as well, by my side as well. When I look at it, it's got, oh God, and then I think that everybody's like that. turn away from it, shut it down, and okay, you can go into it once in a while as a spectator sport to really, but then you have to have your mind in it and sort of, okay, now let's get my daily dose of stupidity and anger, and then you look through it. But then devote the rest of your time to looking at what do people really do with their lives. Look at the work that they're putting into improving the world, the businesses that are being started. Just read a science magazine to look at the interesting research and the innovations that are taking place. And then you realize that even under the worst of circumstances, the worst politics and the nastiest temper, people continue to improve the world. I mean, even though these last 10 years, which have been rough, and we've had the pandemic, and we've had trade wars, and now the war, yet every 88,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day over those past 10 years. Every day, 88,000 people, including the damage from trade wars and from the pandemic and the lockdowns and everything. And that's what I do to remain optimistic, to think about what really goes on in the world rather than just looking at those who are interpreting the world and trying to run the world, because that makes me depressed, and I think that might help us. I think social media, and I love social media, I think it's been an incredible democratization of the public conversation, and it really improves, and I say this completely unironically, it really improves the state of knowledge of the world if you use it wisely, if you go into particular areas where people have a common goal of accumulating more knowledge and learning from one another. I mean, that's what we're doing here, right?
Yes, yeah.
But also you can go into sort of, okay, learn more about truck logistics of the Russian army. I've learned so much that I didn't know I wanted to know about this until recently, and that's through social media. Or from sort of Depeche Mode and Sisters of Mercy bootlegs. How many are there? Which ones have the best sound recordings? There are so much knowledge out there that can be accumulated through social media. The problem is that when we're trying to do this into a global public space where everybody's supposed to have something to say about anything, which means that most likely what people have to say is, "Oh, you're stupid. I don't like this tweet." And then and obviously you'd be depressed if you see that. Yeah. So you're a dickhead. It's like, yeah, that doesn't help me. So if you're trying to, you really have to segment and to find the right places and the right spots. Because if it's the lowest common denominator, it will just be, what's the most drama today? What's the stupidest thing someone said today that we can all retweet? And in that case, we'll all be sad, miserable, and depressed. So stop doing that.
Yeah, that part about social media certainly hit close to home. Because, a couple of days ago, I released an article through FEE about London taxi regulation, and since then we have both been subjected to this absolute avalanche of abusive ad hominem tweets, occasionally making a point, but usually just saying how much they hate us and how terrible we are, and renaming their profiles that they hate the walkers. And so, I sympathise with that.
I'm sorry to hear that. But the key then not to be depressed is to understand that they thought you stupid before they were on social media too. Yes. They were idiots in the world before we saw them on Twitter, before we met them on social media. It was always there. It's always been lots of crazy stuff out there. Keep our eyes focused on what's important and try to ignore the rest. And I know it's impossible. But
I see people posting videos of shops being attacked in London and saying, this didn't happen when I was young. And I was thinking, it did. You just didn't see it.
Happen on the video,
exactly.
It probably happened more. Did you have anything else you wanted to?
So the part of the purpose of our podcast actually aligns really nicely with what you were talking about focusing on the innovations and the progress. So our semi-final question for you is, do you have, of all the work you've done in studying progress in over centuries really, is there any that has been your particular favorite, any particular innovation you've really liked, and if so, how has that encouraged human flourishing?
Wow. Oh, that's a good one. A sort of short list of the favorites. There are so many different ways in which to respond to that question, because in a way it's often the marginal things that we don't really appreciate. I mean, where would we have been without glasses or contact lenses? I would probably have been dead and fell off a cliff somewhere. How much knowledge would have been lost to the world if people hadn't been able to read and write like that because of that? Or you could go with something which is super dramatic, but is still kind of hidden. And if it's not hidden, it's disliked, like artificial fertilizer, which is really our way of getting food from the air. It's crazy. We fixed nitrogen from the air to nourish our plants, and that took thousands of experiments and to create the Haber-Bosch process in the early 20th century. And it's incredibly complex, incredibly difficult, and now people just don't like it because it creates too much nutrition for lakes and oceans, and that's true, and that's a problem. We're going to have to deal with that as well. But it saved the lives of 2 billion people who couldn't have been sustained on a planet without any kind of artificial feeding of plants. So when I think of innovations, I like to go for those ones rather than the ones that we can really sort of see, the computers and the planes and stuff that are already dramatic by themselves. But here's another way of answering this question. I think one thing that has excited me a lot in recent years is to think about how even the most trivial and beneficial innovations were met at originally when people looked at them the first time, because most of the time people just didn't like it because it was new, it was artificial, it was strange, it wasn't the way we used to do things. And I have a video series called New and Improved where I regularly look at some of these, like the bicycle. People really didn't like the bicycle because, it was the dandy horse. This was for the upper classes. They think that they're so powerful they can just run around on a bicycle and hurt everybody. Like people think of electric scooters nowadays, something like that. But one of my absolute favorites, the all-time favorites, is the umbrella, which sounds sort of harmless and beneficial in every single way, right? But the first guy who imported the umbrella, it started in sort of China and then a little bit in Paris and then in London some 300 years ago. He was publicly ridiculed, and people really hated the fact that he walked around with an umbrella to protect himself from the air, because people thought it looked silly, it looked feminine. Some even accused him of being French when he had an umbrella. I mean, you would think that in London, of all places, the guy who solved the problem of living in Britain without getting wet, they would erect statues to him. But no. And the angriest were the coach drivers, the horse and coach drivers, the taxi drivers of the day. Some, they threw rubbish at him, and some even tried to run him over because he would take their jobs. Because they had those covered coaches, so people took them when it was raining, and now this guy walks around without getting wet. We won't have jobs in London in the future if he succeeds with this creative destruction. But he persisted, and that's one of the most important lessons. It takes crazy eccentrics who just believes in their idea. So he walked around for 30 years in London with an umbrella when they hurled abuse and rubbish at him. And yet he persisted, and eventually people start to ask themselves, why should he be all nice and dry when we're out here getting wet? And they began to get around to his position. But it took 30 years for the umbrella in London. And that, I think, tells you something about public resistance to innovation as well. We all love it eventually, once it's been trade tested, once it's incredibly cheap, once everybody does it, so we don't have to look like eccentrics. And it takes these brave characters who continue to experiment, continue to improve, without getting that reward. Being attacked and abused oftentimes. They're heroes. They're my heroes. And we have to recognize then the umbrella carriers of the day who continue to experiment with genetically modified goods, even though their offices are being attacked. Those who implement mRNA technology for vaccines and other drugs are now sort of by many considered to be conspiracy theories, considered to be sort of they're poisoning us and putting chips in our bodies and so on. We have to look at those innovators and heroes and defend them, I think.
Yeah, there seems to be an attitude in society where, or with many people, where they're more interested in reasons not than reasons for. I often advocate for space exploration, and people come to me and say, "Oh, we'll never solve the problem of radiation. You know, people live in space will die of radiation poisoning." And I say, when George Stephenson invented the steam locomotive for passenger use, he made it possible for passengers to travel behind steam engines. People said, "Oh, if you go at 30 miles an hour, you won't be able to breathe."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's always been that attitude of reasons not to rather than reasons to, and it's the people who have the reasons to, and people like Elon Musk who just keep pushing forward regardless of what people say.
Yeah, exactly. And whenever he publishes a bizarre tweet, he's probably high or something, I think that the problem with the world is not that we have too many crazy people like that, it's that we have too few.
Yeah.
And the fact that he and a couple of people like them are almost unconscious of the abuse that is being, and the rubbish that they're being pelted with, is the reason why we continue to see progress. So I admire that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And for our listeners who enjoy hearing about rational optimism and progress and all the wonderful things you study, where can they find you?
Well, the easiest way is just to Google my name or check me out on YouTube, because most of my films and my video blogs are just there. So just check Johan Norberg out. And you can also go, one of the easiest ways is just to go to my official Facebook page, Johan Norberg Official, where I publish everything and keep people informed about what goes on.
All right, we'll put links to that in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.